Hello learners, welcome to another lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In the previous lecture, I described in some detail a famous document in which a Victorian-era scholar and political leader, Thomas Macaulay, made an influential argument about why Indians in Victorian-era India should be educated in English as against other Indian or European languages. I indicated that we would discuss the implications of this policy decision in the literary field as well as in the social context of Victorian-era India. We will focus on how this policy shaped the literary field by focusing on the life and career of Toru Dutt. It's important to briefly recall the kind of predictions that Macaulay had made at the time that he argued for why this would be a good decision. That is, why it would be useful and pragmatic for the British government to educate its Indian subjects in English language and literature. The prediction was that a few Indians, once they became well versed with English, would indirectly educate the rest of their country folks. They would write in English, they would disseminate a sort of Western or European or English sensibility through their writings, and they would serve as unofficial or indirect educators of the wider public of their nation. This was the kind of prediction and the kind of future that Macaulay foresaw when he advocated and advised the British Crown that they should educate their Indian subjects in English. Now, we can test how far these predictions and how real this vision proved to be and whether or not this vision was realized in the life and career of an individual named Toru Dutt. Toru Dutt is an unusual figure and quite a unique figure in the history of English literature as well as in the history of Victorian literature. She was born in India in West Bengal, in what is today known as West Bengal. She lived for a very short period. She died when she was only 21. She was educated in multiple contexts. She produced a remarkable body of writing, and her literary reputation and fame, which grew posthumously, but grew very strongly and has cemented her place as among the most influential writers of the Victorian era. Let's understand a little bit about who Toru Dutt was and where she came from before we go on to study the implications of Victorian-era policies in her sonnet Bogbury. Dutt was born in the year 1856 and died in the year 1877. As several scholars, including Meenakshi Mukherjee, have written, Dutt's locutions and locations render her an emphatically Bengali writer, and in Dutt family context, to be Bengali was also to be what one of her biographers terms a child of the international world. This refers to the enthusiasm and the energy with which English literature as well as English education were received in eastern India along the eastern coast of British India. There are many reasons for why the eastern coast of British India and especially West Bengal became the beneficiaries and so eagerly received English education. One reason for this is because printing arrived in that part of India very early because of the Baptist Mission Press, which established its first press in Serampore. However, this was not the only reason. The other reasons were the cause for reform, and several scholars, intellectuals in that part of British India were very eager to reform what they viewed as some of the misogynist practices of Hindu society. Among these were sati and the treatment of widows, but there were several others. And Dutt family, this family into which Toru Dutt was born, was part of that cultural and intellectual milieu. Dutt's grandfather, Rasamoy Dutt, was an enthusiastic pupil of English literature and possessor of what has been described by one biographer as a splendid collection of English books. Her poet father, that is Toru Dutt's father, Govind Chandra Dutt, published the Dutt Family Album, the first anthology of English poetry written by Bengalis. And her mother, Kshatramani Mittar, confirmed a hard-fought conversion to Christianity by publishing her own Bengali translation of a book entitled The Blood of Jesus with the Tract and Book Society of Calcutta. So, in this brief biographical introduction, we can see the strong connections between the life and career of Toru Dutt, the individual whose writing we will read shortly, and the kind of intellectual as well as technological changes that were taking place in Victorian England and which made their influence felt in British India. What are these developments? First and most obviously, it is the spread of English education. English education was established and disseminated in British India thanks to the British occupation of India. And we see that the Dutt family is among the earliest receivers, but also among the most enthusiastic advocates of English language and literature. The presence of English books also speaks to how firmly this family was embedded in a Victorian culture of the publication and circulation of printed material. Printing was a new thing in 19th century India, and the fact that this family has a collection of English books suggests the strong connection between this group of Indians and their contemporaries in England. Further, the fact that Toru Dutt's mother, despite being an Indian woman, was educated enough to publish her own work, that is, to translate something from a European language to Bengali and have it published, right? Also speaks to the reformist and forward-thinking views that this Bengali family held, views that were very unlike the views of many other Indians of their time. The fact that women in this family are allowed, in fact, encouraged to be educated, to read, write, and to publish their work means that they were light years ahead of many contemporary Indian families. Finally, the fact that mother's first book is published by the Tract and Book Society of Calcutta also signals the spread of print and the fact that print was brought to British India in the earliest instance not by the British government but by the missionaries, that is, individuals who wanted to disseminate printed material with the intention of reforming or converting some Indians from Hinduism to Christianity. These are all the ways in which this family is, despite being in British India, is deeply connected to many of the intellectual and technological developments that were unfolding in Victorian England. And it is in Victorian England that a prose writer comes across the first book by Toru Dutt. And it is this experience which is described in the most famous book of poems, which was published a few years after Toru Dutt died. This is a book that's titled The Ballads and Legends of Hindustan, published in the year 1882. This book has a preface which is titled An Introductory Memoir by the year Edmund Gosse. Edmund Gosse was a Victorian-era literary critic who also had a very interesting story of his own. He was among the earliest practitioners of what would later be recognized as a public literary criticism. He was born into a very devout religious family and was expected to take up a position in the Anglican Church. However, he grew distant from religious matters and was much more interested in the secular concerns of poetry, and described this in a work of very powerful autobiography, which is titled Father and Son. So, this was Edmund Gosse, and Edmund Gosse describes how he came across the work of Toru Dutt in this introductory memoir to the legends and ballads of Hindustan. Gosse writes, "It was while Professor W. Minto was editor of The Examiner that one day in August 1876, in the very heart of the dead season for books, I happened to be in the office of that newspaper and was upbraiding the whole body of publishers for issuing no books worth reviewing. At that moment, the postman brought in a thin and sallow packet with a wonderful Indian postmark on it and containing a most unattractive orange pamphlet of verse, printed Bhavanipur and entitled A Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields by Toru Dutt. A hopeless volume it seemed, with its queer type, published at Bhavanipur, printed at the Saptahik Sambad Press." So, this is how Edmund Gosse describes his first encounter with the name Toru Dutt, with the writings of this Indian Bengali woman who was such an outsider to this Victorian world of letters, and yet whose writing was so powerful that it struck the Victorian literary critic. Uh, it's important to note the markers of Indian printing and how alien these markers appear to Edmund Gosse, who is sitting in the office of this Victorian-era periodical and is looking for good books to review. From this context, words like Saptahik Sambad and Bhavanipur appear utterly alien. In fact, more than alien, they appear to signify inferior quality. And that inferiority is what is reflected in the way Edmund Gosse first reacts. He calls it a hopeless volume and he describes the type as queer. Despite these negative impressions, however, Gosse is astounded and really taken aback by the kind of prose and the kind of writing he finds in this work. Let us now get to know a little bit better this person. Some biographical details of Toru Dutt are important, and these are the details that Edmund Gosse also provides in this introductory memoir. Her father was Govind Chandra Dutt, as has been mentioned earlier. This man had 3 children, all of whom died very early. The son died at the age of 14 in the year 1865, and the remaining 2 children, 2 daughters, stayed with the family for a little more time. These 2 daughters were Aru and Toru. They were born in the years 1854 and 1856, respectively. The childhood of these 2 daughters was spent entirely in Calcutta, and this has been described repeatedly in multiple poems in which Toru Dutt describes growing up in her father's garden house. This is a house in Calcutta, but it is memorable for the greenery, for the foliage, for the trees, for the flowers, and the generally natural beauty that it provides Toru Dutt with, and the kind of metaphysical space that this greenery creates, which proves to be most conducive for the development of the poet. Now, at the age of 13, in the year 1869, Toru Dutt first goes to Europe. This is after the family has converted, and it describes most powerfully a yearning held by the father, but also shared by the rest of the family, to embrace what they could of European culture. Their intention was to settle in Europe, but that proved to be difficult and not possible. As a result, they traveled for a few years in Europe, after which they came back to India. In Europe, the two daughters had quite an eclectic education. They went to school for the first and last time at a French pension. They traveled with their father to Italy and England, and subsequently attended lectures for women at Cambridge. In the year 1873, the family came back to India, and that is to say, to their father's garden house, the house with the gardens, which has been described in multiple poems. And it is in that house that Toru Dutt spent the last 4 years of her life. And here is how Edmund Gosse describes these last 4 years. In November 1873, they went back again to Bengal, and the 4 remaining years of Toru's life were spent in the old garden house at Calcutta, in a feverish dream of intellectual effort and imaginative production. When we consider what she achieved in these 45 months of seclusion, it is impossible to wonder that the frail and hectic body succumbed under so excessive a strain. We can see in these words an attempt to create a mythical, almost long suffering, martyred life of the poet. In Gosse's view, the experiences that these two young women had, that is, their travels and their education, although short but so rich, and the fact that so much experience and education and exposure to new cultures was compressed into so short a time must have proved overwhelming and must have led to the stress that ultimately led to the demise of this individual. We can see the beginnings of a sort of patronizing and condescending attitude, which will become more and more strong and will grow in intensity as this introductory memoir proceeds. Further, Edmund Gosse then makes some comments on the volume that he had first received in that time in the year 1876. This volume, which was published in Bhawanipur and which had reached him in his office at the Examiner, was titled Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields. This is a translation. This contained many translations from nearly 100 French poets. Gosse writes that it should have been performed at all is so extraordinary that we forget to be surprised at its inequality. The English verse is sometimes exquisite, at other times the rules of prosody are absolutely ignored, and it is obvious that the Hindu poetess was chanting to herself a music that is discord in an English ear. So we can see the effects of Orientalism and the effects of the kind of logic that Thomas Macaulay had put forward in this statement, which aims to or which seeks to praise the talents of a writer, but which cannot quite stay away or keep away from commenting on the religion or the national identity or the religious upbringing of this poet. Simply by looking at the quality of the English poems that this writer has produced, Edmund Gosse feels the liberty and the authority to claim that the imperfect prosody of these English lines emerges from the fact that this Hindu poetess was chanting to herself a music that is discord in an English ear. Now, this work, Sheaf Gleaned in French Fields, the anthology of translations from French into English, was ignored in England, ignored except for the kind words that Edmund Gosse wrote. Except for these kind words, it was ignored in England, but it was very well received in France. There was, in this reception of this translation from French to English, also we can see the workings of Orientalism. A well-known French Orientalist, that is Garcin de Tassy, spoke about this volume to Mademoiselle Clarisse Bader, the author of a somewhat remarkable book on the position of women in ancient Indian society. So we can see that this seems to be a trend. Many scholars and experts on India seem to repeat the strain that it is a backward society because of the way it treats women. In this instance, there is an erstwhile anthropologist who has written about the condition of women in ancient India. And to this scholar, uh, Toru Dutt's poems and translations from the French are recommended. Toru Dutt then reads this scholar and offers to translate her work into English as well. And here is how Edmund Gosse describes Dutt's translation. Dutt was moved to translate it into English for the use of Hindus less instructed than herself. Now, in this phrase, less instructed than herself, we can hear more than a faint echo of what Macaulay had predicted, that a small class of Indians would take it upon themselves to make their vernaculars by degrees fit the vehicle of English rationalism. Right? This is what Toru Dutt is doing. She is translating the work of a French Orientalist, which is claimed to describe the backwardness of Indian society by describing how women were treated in ancient India. And for Gosse, this translation is a praiseworthy and remarkable attempt because it aims to increase the level of instruction or education in British India, those who are less instructed than herself. So Toru Dutt, in this case, in this moment, has become the kind of biracial, bichromatic Indian that Macaulay had predicted and aimed and tried to create through his recommendation that the best possible language in which to educate Indians in British India is English. The goal was to create a class of Indians who would be Indian in blood and appearance, but would be English in their opinions and their thinking. For Edmund Gosse, that is exactly what Toru Dutt is. Now, of course, Edmund Gosse is, if not wrong, certainly not able to take a complete and holistic perspective. And there is a lot more to Toru Dutt than simply this kind of a biracial or bichromatic Indian. And let's try and understand further. Edmund Gosse will repeat this kind of an Orientalist reading again and again, several times. And he will make some comments on a romance novel that Toru Dutt had written in French and which was later translated into English and published as an English novel. While commenting on this novel that Toru Dutt had written, Edmund Gosse writes, "In this description, we seem to recognize some Surya or Soma of Hindu mythology, and the final touch, meaningless as applied to an European, reminds us that in India, whiteness of skin has always been a sign of aristocratic birth from the days when it originally distinguished the conquering Aryas from the disingenuous race of the Dasyus." Now, of course, this kind of statement is quite nonsensical and, if not offensive, and racist today. In the year 1882, however, this kind of a statement could pass as having a great deal of scholarly merit. And it is for us to note that this kind of judgment, this kind of an assumption that whiteness of skin signifies aristocratic birth, and that this also is connected to the history of India somehow, this was a direct consequence of Orientalism. This is a case of half-informed histories being accepted and transformed by the racialist logic of imperial expansion. So, the author of this sentence has a limited notion of the history of India, and he's combining that limited knowledge of the history of India with another assumption, which is that those with fair skin have a sort of cultural or moral legitimacy to control those with darker skin. Of course, the difference in the skin color applied most obviously to the dynamic between the British government and the Indian subjects. But in this instance here, that racial dynamic, that racial inequality is being transposed onto a different context in order to justify the Indianness, in order to cement the idea that Toru Dutt was an authentic Indian writer. This is an idea that will die very hard in the sense that this is an idea that will inform much later scholarship as well. The idea that identity somehow enables better writing, or that in order for an Indian writer to write well about India, they have to be more Indian than others. This idea will prove to be remarkably difficult to challenge, and we can see its beginnings in this Orientalist discourse. The assumption that Sanskrit writing was Hindu, or that Indian writers wrote in Sanskrit and were Hindu, these kinds of assumptions, and that fair skin equals aristocracy, these kinds of assumptions were circulating in this time, and they gained a great deal of legitimacy. One last thing to note about this statement: despite the problematic and unfair and racist assumptions of the statement, this is also the only manner in which a Victorian literary critic could recognize the literary merit of a writer from India. So, Orientalism was the price that many Indian writers paid to be recognized as good writers in Victorian England. Right? So, while on one hand, we have to give some credit to Edmund Gosse for recognizing, popularizing, and making sure that the work of Toru Dutt is placed in the archive and not forgotten, we must also be aware of the price that such recognition often carries with it. And often it is a hidden and quite pernicious and quite damaging cost. We will continue to examine how this dynamic of racialist assumptions of identity versus a positive evaluation of literary merit, how that dynamic proceeds, and how that dynamic can allow us to better understand the writing of Toru Dutt in the next lecture. Thank you.